Okay, now it's time. So hello everyone and welcome to the third week of the webinar series, A Carbon Neutral Society Action Month, hosted by Kyushu University in cooperation with APRU. I'm Natalie Konomi. I'm a professor and a manager of the Global Strategies Office at Kyushu University, and I will be your MC again today. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that this webinar will be recorded, and we will actually temporarily upload it also, the recordings on the APRU website. Also, as you may already be aware, this event is a regular Zoom meeting, which we believe is less anonymous than a webinar, which means we would really like you to turn on your cameras if your surroundings permit, especially during the discussion time. And but also now, it would be nice to see faces. And but keep your microphones off if you don't, if you're not instructed to turn them on. I do see now some familiar faces and names actually on my screen today from our previous sessions. Thank you for joining again. And I'm also happy to see new faces and, well, not faces necessarily, but names. Therefore, please let me briefly explain about the background of this webinar series. We all know climate change affects everything, society and industries. And it's really important for us now to work toward a carbon neutral society and implement solutions that support sustainability and also at the same time economic growth. So to solve today's challenges effectively and without compromising people's well-being, we must call on the expertise and the passion of well-established and younger researchers as well from a variety of disciplines. And that actually would be all of you. So this Carbon Neutral Society Action Month webinar highlights APRU University's research initiatives, but also other universities' initiatives to preserve the global environment and achieve a sustainable society. And by bringing together such a diverse group of experts and researchers from several scientific fields, we all aim to tackle climate change and develop a sustainable society. So we hope that this webinar series will encourage idea exchange, cross-disciplinary discussions, and collaborative solution development. So it's really important, we think, to continue building an international network focused on a carbon neutral society. And that's what we actually try to do here. This webinar series is a pilot for a longer term program on global environment preservation and a carbon neutral society. And we want to know how early career researchers and others with different degrees of environmental knowledge, like engineers, scientists, economists, social scientists, policymakers, community members, educators, well, anyone can really collaborate and share knowledge to fight climate change. I would now like to outline the schedule for today. Today we are focusing on low carbon negative emission. We are happy to have 3 speakers with us who will each give a keynote speech of 20 minutes on their research, followed by a short Q&A session, which will then kind of lead us into the panel discussion, which altogether will be again 30 minutes. And then we will have probably a 5 or 10 minute break after the presentations and panel discussions before we start with our poster sessions. So I would like to introduce today's presenters in order of appearance. I'm very honored to welcome Professor Shigenori Fujikawa from Kyushu University. You might be waving in the camera. And Professor Brandon Barrett from Osaka University. And Professor Makena Kaufman from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And well, thank you to the 3 of you for joining today's session. Now, I'd also like to invite everyone to ask questions during the Q&A session and actively join the panel discussion afterwards. We're really eager to hear from all of you. If you have questions during the presentations, please feel free to write them down in the chat the moment you have the question so that you don't forget about it. And we will first listen to all 3 presentations before we have a Q&A session. So we will address them during the Q&A session. Of course, you're welcome to ask the questions directly during the Q&A session as well. Now, please keep in mind that this is a Zoom meeting, so don't turn on your microphones unless you're instructed to do so. I would like to invite our first keynote speaker today, Professor Shigenori Fujikawa. Dr. Shigenori Fujikawa is Distinguished Professor of the International Institute for Carbon Neutral Energy Research and Director of the Research Center for Negative Emissions Technologies at Kyushu University. He received his PhD degree from Kyushu University. He did his postdoctoral research at Yale University as a JSPS postdoctoral fellow and Riken as a special postdoctoral researcher. He has led his independent research group at Riken from 2004 to 2012 before he joined the Kyushu University faculty in 2012. He was promoted to professor in 2021 and was immediately recognized as a distinguished professor. His current research interests include study of nanofabrication and development of nanomaterials for sustainability applications, and he's currently focusing on CO2 capture by nanomembranes. Currently, he's a program manager of the Japanese Moonshot Research and Development Program and is leading the research project of development of global CO2 recycling technology towards beyond zero emission. Professor Fujikawa will be talking about negative carbon emission by nanometer thick membranes, aiming for a carbon recycling society. Professor Fujikawa, please.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and good evening. I'm very honored to have my presentation in this seminar. So today I will talk about the negative carbon emission by our developed nanometer thick membranes, so-called nanomembranes, aiming for carbon recycling society. So I found a good movie to understand how much we emit the CO2 into the atmosphere. This is a kind of situation of the CO2 emission in the New York City. As you can see here, you can see the blue sphere. It has a 10-meter diameter and the inside it contains 1 ton CO2. And then this movie shows how people quickly emit the CO2 into the atmosphere. So this is very, as you can see here, so this is a real-time, emission speed. Actually, in 1 second, almost two sphere is emitted, and also 1 hour later, the height of the this kind of ball is half of the Empire State Building. The 1 hour, so almost Empire State is covered. And 1 year, as you can see here, we can build a very high mountain of CO2. So the height is almost identical to the Mount Fuji, 3,700 nanometers in this case. It is very huge. Of course, this amount is only emitted from the New York City, Manhattan area. That is why we have a lot of large city in our Earth. That is why you can easily imagine how much we emit the CO2 into the air. Oh, sorry. And then I'd like to ask you one thing. What is the total weight of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Not this is volume, this is the weight. So we continuously emit the CO2 into the atmosphere. Of course, CO2 does not fall automatically. It means that CO2 is accumulated in the atmosphere. So please imagine the weight of the CO2 which we emit to the atmosphere. All right, because time limitation, so I'd like to say answer. So this is the approximate weight of the CO2 in the atmosphere. As you can see here, this is of course this is a very rough calculation, but we could estimate 1 or 2 teraton of CO2. So I think you cannot imagine how big this number. Actually, when you compare the automobile number in the all worldwide. So as you can see here, this one is the number of car is now acting on the Earth. Even one car has a 10 ton, but this weight cannot exceed this CO2 weight in the atmosphere. That is why you can imagine we have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. Of course, we have to make a big effort to reduce, to mitigate the CO2 emission, but also we have to capture CO2 from air. Otherwise, we cannot suppress, temperature increase, average temperature increase. That is why people has to do something like, CO2 negative emission, so-called. This is graph shows, say, kind of CO2 emission annually. And so this one is, say, if we don't do anything about the treatment of CO2 emission, So as you can see here, the emission of CO2 is increasing the year. But of course, we will try to introduce the CO2 mitigation technology of CO2. So as a CCS, carbon capture and storage. In that case, the green part is a reduction amount of the CO2 emission. But also you still have a gray part, which cannot be reduced the technology. That is why this to reduce the CO2 concentration in atmosphere, we have to introduce some kind of negative emission technology. Right. So of course, this is a challenging topic because the concentration of CO2 is pretty low, only 0.04%. As you can actually, so 400 ppm is seems to be high, but for scientists or technology industry, 400 ppm is pretty low. That is why it is difficult to capture the CO2 directly from the air by the economically feasible way. Of course, there is many technology which proposed for negative emission technology as shown here. So of course, except for direct air capture, this is only the artificial way to capture CO2 from the air. Most of technology are often utilize the nature-based CO2 capture system. But of course, this kind of nature-based system is good, but sometimes it has some limitation. That is why we have to develop the artificial CO2 capture technology directly from air, so-called direct CO2, direct air capture. And then, of course, this technology has attracted much attention. That is why many billionaires, trillionaires try to invest the big money to develop the direct air capture technology. As you can see here, Bill Gates also invests a huge amount of money for the direct air capture technology, but also, Elon Musk also put something like a price, which gives $1 million to develop the direct air capture technology. But many people try to develop and focusing on the developing the direct air capture technology. So one of the biggest company, the venture company, so-called Climeworks, recently launched the direct air capture system in Iceland. This factory can capture the 4,000 tons of CO2 per year directly from air. Of course, they are after capturing CO2, they try to inject the underground to store CO2 safely. Of course, their business style is say kind of the carbon credit type of the system. So even when you access to the Climeworks, you can buy the CO2 to contribute the CO2 reduction in the atmosphere. So technically, so there are not so many technology to capture CO2 from the air. So this is a major technology to capture CO2 by the liquid-based absorption, solid-based absorption, and membrane separation. So Climeworks or Carbon Engineering and other major company using the kind of chemical sorption technology, because this technology has an advantage because this is highly feasible. Because basically this technology is already installed in the factory to treat the gas, emission gas. That's why when we simply say, when we change the solvent or absorption material for the CO2, you can easily develop the process. That is why this is highly feasible, and also this process so many large amount of volume. However, this technology requires some improvement. So after basically this technology consumes a lot of energy, because once the chemical material absorbs the CO2, you have to release the CO2 again to recover this solvent material. But for this purpose, you have to heat or vacuum. So this kind of heating vacuum will consume a lot of energy. That is why this kind of consuming a lot of energy has a problem. But when we consider the membrane technology, nobody focus on the membrane technology for the direct air capture. Even this is a major technology of the CO2 capture. The reason why people are focusing on the membrane technology for direct air capture. Is described by the Professor David Keith, who is a professor in Harvard and also co-founder of the carbon engineering. The reason why nobody have never considered the membrane as a direct air capture technology is, using the membrane to separate CO2 from the air is at least, driving force for CO2 is at most 40 Pascal, because concentration of the CO2 in the atmosphere is only 0.04%. Atmospheric pressure is 100,000 Pascal. It means the partial pressure of CO2 is only 4 Pascal. This is quite small. And also currently commercially available CO2 capture membrane does not have so much high CO2 flux. So from the both situation, these membrane separation seems to be implausible. That is why nobody considered the membrane technology for that. However, we focus on this point. So if the low gas permeance itself limits the development of membrane-based system, that is why if we have a good membrane which has a high CO2 flux, membrane also can be used as a direct air capture technology. Right, then we developed the very thin film, thin CO2 capture membrane, which the thickness is only 34 nanometers in this case. This is a very thin membrane. And also because of the CO2 flux in proportion to the membrane thickness, that is why thinner membrane shows a faster CO2 flux. That is why thinner membrane is good. So of course it is difficult to make such kind of thin film for CO2 separation membrane. Then our developed membrane shows the world high CO2 permeance, which is 20 or 30 times higher than the previous reported case. That is why we believe our membrane can be used for the direct air capture. To prove that this idea, we tested a simple experiment as shown here. Well, we set the membrane here, and then we introduce the diluted CO2 in the nitrogen case. In this case, we use 1,000 ppm, which is 2 times higher than the higher concentration of the atmosphere. And then we just feed this mixture gas into the membrane separation chamber. And then we monitor the concentration of the CO2 in the retented side and permeate side. And then we calculate how much percent of CO2 pass, how much percent cannot pass the membrane by using this special gas chromatography system. And then when we use the conventional membrane thickness, say around 4 micron case, of course, CO2 concentration in the permeate site is only a few percent. It means that most of the CO2 cannot pass, and then just release from the retented site. But when we use a very thin film, only thickness is 150 nanometer case, so a quarter of the CO2 can pass through the membrane, even under the very mild pressure condition. Of course, this is not sufficient, but this is a meaningful number for us. So, and also we think, to my best knowledge, this our newly developed separation membrane efficiently separate the even low concentration CO2 gas. This is, I think, the first result in all over the world. And then we developed a multiple separation system for directly CO2 capture directly from the air. Actually, this is here you can see here. This is a part. It has 10 seat of our nanomembrane. This is first stage of the membrane separation. Then after separation of the air at this part, the permeate gas is introduced the second separation module around here. And then we monitor the CO2 concentration is after stage 1 separation and stage separation, stage 2 separation case. So this is the time lapse of here. As you can see here, this is our room concentration and our experimental room. As you can see here, so stage 1 quickly reached the 1,000, almost saturated 3,000 case, and then second stage separation it reached more than 1% actually. So of course, this saturation reaches around the 30 minutes. So it means that we can directly capture CO2 from the air by simply membrane filtration. And then this is a graph show, and this is a graph to the behavior of the CO2 concentration after the membrane separation. As you can see here, stage 1 case, just CO2 concentration reach the 3,000. This is a very good agreement with our process simulation. And the second stage 2, so it exceeds 10,000 ppm. It means more than 1%. It means we can effectively capture CO2 from the atmosphere. Then, of course, that is why membrane technology has the potential for the CO2 capture directly from air. And then, what is the merit of the membrane for direct air capture? So, of course, membrane is a very simple and inexpensive process, and also membrane separation doesn't use a toxic chemical. And of course, membrane is a kind of just simple air filter. That is why no size limitation for insulation. And also size is adjustable. When you change the membrane size or module size, so you can easily adjust the size. It means that this membrane separation can be considered as a technology CO2 capture anywhere. Of course, atmospheric condition is atmospheric CO2 concentration is averagely 400 ppm immediately. But when you look at the more deeper side, so emission at kind of say emission of CO2 at a large city is pretty high, as you can see here. So red area emits CO2 concentration emission is pretty high. That is why such kind of CO2 capture at such kind of large city is very effective, and this large city is a good source to capture CO2 from the air. So in such a purpose, so membrane separation may be a best solution because of the advantages which I explained in before. And also, you have to consider the scenario after the CO2 capture technology. So otherwise, we have to manage the CO2 after CO2 capture, right? And also, this scheme so-called the carbon capture utilization storage, right? Well, carbon capture is the first stage, but also you have to consider the two-way. One is the utilization and storage. Well, storage is a kind of geological storage. It means that captured CO2 is injected into the underground, right? This is straightforward to reduce the CO2 concentration, and also CO2 can be considered as a carbon source. That is why sometimes we need such kind of carbon species as an alternative material fossil fuel, fossil resource. So this is the kind of list of the carbon recycling targets, including chemical, fuel, mineral, something like that. In our research institute, we have a good collaborator, Professor Miho Yamauchi and Professor Paul Kenneth. They have a very nice skill to develop the good catalyst to convert the CO2 to the such methane, ethylene, ethanol, carbon monoxide, which are very important chemical in the industrial area. And also Paul Kenneth is a very expert of the electrochemical conversion of CO2. So that is why we have a collaboration with them to manage capture CO2. And then, so based on this collaboration, we are aiming to develop this kind of direct air capture and utilization system, so-called DACU system, we name it. This is the kind of simple schematic illustration of our target system. First, we separate the CO2 by membrane, and then convert CO2 to the value-added compound in the electrochemical way. And then we try to develop a small module of this system, then install it into the urban city area to capture CO2 from the air and convert the methane, right? Then this methane is a kind of good to circulate in the down and city area, because city has gas pipeline here. That is why such kind of effort can contribute to develop the local production, local consumption for the carbon recycle society. And then for this purpose, we are awarded to do some national research projects, so-called Moonshot Research and Development Program. So this is a program is promoting the highly risk, high impact research and development, aiming to achieve the ambitious moonshot goal and solve the issue of the facing future society. This is a member of our major member of the research project. So with this, through this collaboration with this researcher, we are trying to develop the global CO2 recycling technology toward the beyond zero emission. And also, our technology basically focusing on to capture CO2 from air and to make such kind of useful product. And then our Kyushu University has a very unique faculty of art. And then we have a collaboration with one professor who is a department of the art. And then we put some, we explained our basic technology, and then we asked the graduate student to design the future based on the technology. This is an example of the design product, which is designed by the graduate student in the Kyushu University. And then some student proposed the carbon neutral bus and also something like street furniture to capture CO2 in the downtown and convert to the CO2 to the methane to circulate in the downtown city. And also this is a very unique carbon emission carbon right. It means this is a slide and then it has our dark fuel system. And then when in emergency situation, this park is this park acts as a kind of energy supplying place for emergency situation. That is why we are trying to develop such kind of the unique system to circulate the carbon CO2 in our local area. So we are now trying to propose the unique concept of the ubiquitous carbon capture to develop the negative emission society. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Fujikawa, for this very inspiring and fascinating talk. So to our audience, as a reminder, please feel free to post your questions in the chat, which we will address in our Q&A session. And Professor Fujikawa can stop sharing his slide maybe now. And I would like to invite our second speaker right away for today, Professor Brendan Barrett. Dr. Barrett is specially appointed professor at the Center for Global Initiatives at Osaka University. Urban planner by training and fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, his core expertise covers ethical cities, urban sustainability, and climate change. Born and educated in the United Kingdom, he has worked on the environmental assessment of major development projects, most notably with APRU and partners, and as an international civil servant with the United Nations Environment Programme and United Nations University in Japan. Throughout his career, he has occupied teaching and research roles at universities in the UK, Japan, and Australia. He is lead educator of two Future Learn massive open online courses on ethical cities, produced in 2016 and 2021, and co-author of the 2020 book on the same topic, calling for a new approach to urbanism that aligns three goals: good governance, poverty elimination, and rapid decarbonization of the economy. Complementing his academic career, he has received numerous awards for his documentary filmmaking and for his work communicating complex scientific issues with the founding of the Our World online magazine. Professor Barrett will be talking about prospects for accelerated decarbonization at the subnational level. So, Professor Barrett, please.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you, Professor Fujikawa, for a very inspiring presentation. I really want to believe that technology can solve the problem and also can help do it in a very, very quick period of time. I think time is actually of the essence, and that is why I'm focusing my interests on accelerated decarbonization, really asking ourselves the question of how quickly can we move to this net zero target. And my basic argument is that we should be aiming, especially in the rich economies of the world, at net zero by 2035. Now, you might think I'm somewhat crazy to present that, or that I'm just pulling this idea out of the air. But to be honest, we're seeing more and more scientists focusing on this, and we're seeing detailed implementation pathways emerging. And this target of 2035 is starting to pop up more and more in different studies around the world. So I suspect that we're beginning to get a real idea of the urgency of the climate emergency that we face and the need to move rapidly. At the same time, there's a number of reports that have been coming out, and I hope that you get access to my slides later so you can dig into these. But these reports are saying that, for instance, we need to phase out oil production in rich economies by 2034 in order to be in line with the Paris Agreement. And that in order to keep to 1.5 degree temperature increase, then we basically need to keep 40% of developed reserves unextracted. So we're not even able to use the oil and fossil fuel reserves that are actually available to us now, let alone exploring and developing other new resources. So we're really in a tight position right now. And scientists have started to talk about the notion of carbon bombing. And maybe this is the first time you're hearing this, but it's basically suggesting that new projects that oil and gas companies want to develop, if they were able to go ahead and develop all of them, it would be the same as just setting off carbon bombs and make it impossible for us to meet the Paris targets. So we have to drastically rethink our energy system, and we really need to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. So that's why we're starting to see banners like this. So this is actually coming from an environmental group called Extinction Rebellion, but it's really interesting to see that scientists, the language of scientists, and even some of the actions of climate scientists is beginning to mirror what the environmental activists are doing. And we even have scientists who are protesting. They're saying that we keep telling you about the science, but you're not listening. So we need now to get out on the street and demonstrate, which is an interesting and quite curious situation to find ourselves in, because it sort of questions, what is the role of the scientist? And up until now, the scientist has been an objective, basically, they have to promote objectivity in their work. But now in this very difficult circumstances, many think they actually have to become activists. So Extinction Rebellion is an interesting organization, and they have 3 requests in the UK. First, tell the truth about climate change and declare a climate and ecological emergency. Act now. And they have this idea of net zero by 2025, but they are also realizing that that's going to slip by, and we're nowhere near going to be able to achieve it. And then they talk about going beyond politics, which is actually trying to involve more people in addressing this challenge. So it seems like net zero has been around forever, but actually it's a very new idea. So we built up through the Paris Agreement to this very sort of landmark IPCC report in 2018, where the first time we start to hear the term net zero emissions of CO2 by mid-century. Coincidentally, that's when Extinction Rebellion popped up and started their activities. So it's only really 4 years that we've been really getting our minds around this notion of net zero by 2050. And in that period, we've had a pandemic to deal with as well. So the actual effort of pushing forward on this net zero target has been somewhat challenging in those circumstances. And unfortunately, since the Kyoto Protocol, we've only really seen, we haven't really seen this very, very ambitious levels of action by governments. So if you see, you can see linear implementation is just going a straight line from where emissions are now to 2050, and then there is delayed emissions, and then the notion of accelerated is where you can you actually have a dip, very steep dip in emission levels at the earliest possible date. And if you look at the how different countries are performing, this is taken from the UNEP emissions gap report, you see it's only the UK that has actually been slightly accelerated compared to the linear model. And what's happening in many countries, they're delaying their actual the peak of emissions. And in some instances, they actually they're not going to net zero by 2050. So what that means is there's more cumulative emissions. We'll all get to the target, but there'll be more cumulative emissions if you delay. The UK is interesting in this context, but because they do have a fairly ambitious target, which is a 78% reduction in emissions by 2035. And that's actually also embodied in the 2008 Climate Change Act. There's very few countries that actually have legislation for this. And even the October 21 net zero strategy from the British government was criticized as lacking really concrete measures. So there's still a lot of work to be done by national governments, and it's somewhat disappointing that we find ourselves at 2022 and still in this position of trying to get into the details of how we transform our economies. And if you look at the trends, so for instance, if you look at emissions going back to the 1970s, you can see that basically it's an upward trend, and it's things like the collapse of the Soviet Union or the global financial crisis in 2010, and then most recently COVID, where we see a dip in emissions. And that's not really a good message, because it shouldn't be just through economic recessions, and it shouldn't be through a pandemic that we find this dip occurring. We need actually the trajectory to have been changing by now. And what we see is that, according to the International Energy Agency, emissions are back up again. So the question is how are we going to get those emissions really going down across the globe? So local government has actually been pointed to as a key player in this. And as Fujikawa sensei showed, there are also the cities where emissions are concentrated. So it's very encouraging to see, as in this case, hundreds of local governments setting net zero targets and covering quite a large proportion of the global population. Likewise, in Japan, we've seen a recent surge, actually, of local governments adopting a net zero target. So, for instance, back in September 2019, there were only 20 local governments in Japan that had a net zero target, and now it's jumped to 118, covering 93% of the Japanese population. But do take it with a pinch of salt, because you have to dig into this. And there are reports, that, for instance, indicating in the US, many US cities don't have ambitious targets, and they're certainly not in line with the Paris Agreement. There's also problems for local governments just actually compiling the data, identifying the boundaries, doing the calculations, and so on. And there has been a tendency for cities to really focus on emissions that are generated within the city boundaries, rather than looking at how the city interacts with the global economy, where goods and services come from, and those aviation and so on and so forth, and the emissions tied into those. So I've looked at a number of cities and their plans, and you can see that they range from right on the agreed scientific target of net zero by 2050 to very ambitious targets, such as Copenhagen and this net zero by 2025. And the question that comes to mind is, how is it that Copenhagen is able to push for a target of net zero 2025 and other cities are not? And so if you try to dig into that, some interesting observations emerge. So one key observation actually is the fact that it's very much tied into how rapidly a city can switch over to renewable energy. And you see when, for instance, in the case of the Australian Capital Territory, they reached 100% renewable in 2020, and then immediately they increased the ambition of their emission reduction targets. In some other instances, such as Oslo, Leeds, and Copenhagen, it's much more difficult for them to introduce renewable energy because they're tied into the national energy system. And so they have to negotiate with national government and pressure national government to accelerate this transition. Okay, so just what my colleagues and I did was actually analyze the existing scientific literature on decarbonization at the local level and try to come up with an understanding of what factors are most influential or most influential in accelerating this transition to net zero. And we split it into two areas. One was policy development and the other was implementation. So on the policy development side, it is actually very challenging. So there's a few things going on. Firstly, it's really difficult to develop robust emission accounting systems. There are methodologies out there, but not all local governments are using them, and which is this, adopting recognized methodologies. For instance, Fukushima Prefecture has a scientific advisory committee, but they're not using the protocols that have been developed internationally. Being really transparent on the assumptions is another thing. Climate emergency declarations have been identified as important in terms of bringing about innovation in organizational structures and planning and resources. We need to see policy governance innovation. So what I mean by that is actually getting more people involved through citizen assemblies, citizen juries, participatory budgeting. So people having a say in how climate mitigation expenditure is arriving, and local government and private sector working together is really important, especially around financing. And then maybe one of the most significant is actually framing the decarbonization transition in terms of economic benefits. So how many jobs are going to be generated? Where are subsidies currently going? What's our climate budget? On the implementation side, as I mentioned previously, rapid transition to 100% renewable. And it has to be a mix as well of technology oriented and social interventions. So we need what Professor Fujikawa is talking about, but we also need some social interventions as well. We can't just rely on the techno fix, mainly also because we don't know how quickly these will roll out. We need to change the energy supply, but also look at demand. So how do we overall reduce energy demand in the city? We need to influence consumer practice and behavior. And then also see this as innovations across whole systems. So yes, we need electric vehicles, but we need charging infrastructure. We need zero carbon electricity. We need EV recycling. The whole system needs to be implemented. And then we also need to look at interactions across boundaries. I mentioned, for instance, that cities require national government to help with the energy policy, the energy infrastructure. So that's the kind of adjacent systems that cities can do a bit, but they also need state support in achieving that. And then perhaps the most challenging and controversial is phasing out unsustainable technologies. And so it's some topic that's a little bit taboo, but for instance, trying to phase out or ban fossil fuel vehicles is something that we're going to have to do at a certain point in time, but it takes a brave politician to stand up and say that. So we did an analysis of these different cities and basically using a traffic light system. And what you can see there is that the more green and orange that you have, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to move to accelerate your decarbonization and reach a target, in case of Copenhagen or Leeds, of around 2025, 2030. And what I did then was try to map how the performance of these cities and their targets relates to this notion of accelerated decarbonization. So you see that the current trajectory is one of a linear trajectory to 2050, and the accelerated one sees us going linear down to 2035. I plotted the actual data of the emission reductions so far, and then I looked at what targets they're projecting. So you can see Copenhagen was a little bit slow in reducing emissions. Emissions were still going down, but then around 2010, they tried to accelerate to get to net zero by 2025. Leeds, again, is quite close to the linear, and then suddenly it's beginning to accelerate in around 2015. But you can see Oslo, emissions climbing for a time, and then they become more ambitious. And the interesting example is Fukushima Prefecture, where emissions started to go up. And I think one of the reasons why was, the Fukushima nuclear accident, the shift away from nuclear, the need to introduce coal power, and so on. And now Fukushima is playing catch up to get to net zero by 2050. The Leeds is a great case study. And I just very quickly talk about that, because what they've done is, back in 2012, they made a solid economic case for decarbonization. Then in 2019, they had this emergency declaration, which is really interesting. And then they set the target of net zero by 2030. They produced their first roadmap in 2019. And what I really like about that roadmap is the level of detail. So they really give a breakdown of everything they're trying to do. They then followed that by a 3-month consultation. 3-month consultation, the big Leeds climate conversation with people in the city. And then they set up a climate jury to actually analyze and develop measures to reduce emissions. And this report was produced in 2019. And they have this pathway now that's just recently been published. And you can see that they have these ideas of like cost-effective measures and showing just how much money could be reduced per year from the energy bill and how many jobs would be created. This is a really fantastic way to present it, especially for policymakers. Then they go, okay, we can have even more ambitious measures, and that will help make another 10% reduction in emissions. And then to get to our target, these are the sorts of things that we need to do. And these are the innovative interventions that are required. And eventually, if we are able to take these 3 steps, we'll get to net zero by 2050. There's a few critically important issues. As I've mentioned before, a lot of cities are just simply focusing on what's called scope 1 emissions that are generated within the city, and they're not looking at scope 2 and scope 3 effectively, and that can be slightly misleading when you look at their emission reduction targets. And they basically, cities should be employing these global protocols that are being developed. And when they're not employing them, then you have to ask why they aren't. Budget is really important. So for instance, Oslo is trying to really get into aligning its budget more effectively with climate mitigation and adaptation. And so they have the strategy and they have their climate budget. But I also think it's important for local governments to redirect their other expenditure and to avoid, so that it's in line with the climate goals. So if they can avoid, building new roads or, policies that are going to increase traffic, if they can redirect it, that could be very powerful. And so finally, I would say that these accelerated roadmaps, pathways and targets actually align much more closely with our existing modes of governance, policy making and funding cycles. So politicians have like a 4-year term. We have to get them to act in their 4-year term. And when we set targets like net zero by 2050, what that really does is it encourages the policymaker and the politician just to pass that burden down to future leaders. Like, it's too difficult for me. I'm sure the next leader will come along and will be able to solve the problem. And I think that the fact that we're not actually increasing our level of ambition is really slowing down the development and diffusion of the low carbon technologies that Professor Fujikawa was talking about. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for this very stimulating talk, actually. To our audience, as a reminder, please feel free to post your questions or comments already in the chat. I see we already are getting some, so thank you. And I would now like to welcome our next and final keynote speaker for today, Professor McKenna Kaufman. McKenna is the director for the University of Hawaii at Manoa Institute for Sustainability and Resilience. She is a professor of urban and regional planning and teaches the graduate seminar in climate change across the Asia-Pacific region. Her research interest is climate change policy, including greenhouse gas mitigation, alternative transportation strategies, and climate adaptation. She is a research fellow with the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, holds a BA in International Relations from Stanford University, and a PhD in economics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She currently serves on the City and County of Honolulu Climate Change Commission. So Makina will talk about decarbonization pathways for Hawaii. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you so much. This is a great turnout in audience, and it's nice to see some familiar names. Let me get my screen sharing. Can everybody see that? Okay, wonderful. So I want to kind of start where Brendan really painted this picture of accelerated decarbonization, the need for rapid decarbonization, and the role of local governments in doing this. And I liked what you said, Brendan, in terms of, it's 2022 and we're still in the details of how to transform our economies, right? And so I want to go into an example of one local government trying to transform its economy. So particularly the case of Hawaii and the decarbonization strategies we've been employing here, and get a little bit into the weeds about, what are the things that we're trying to move forward and how. And overall, my key takeaway is that local government setting and target setting and moving forward policies is really, really important. However, it really does need to be a whole of government approach, right? We need national governments and municipal governments to be working together in this, and as well as with global cooperation, if we're going to meet these enormous challenges and the speed and the urgency of these enormous challenges, right? So give a little context. So Hawaii, we have a net zero goal by 2045. And this target, and actually the language of the law reads we should achieve net negative greenhouse gas emissions as soon as practicable, and no later than 2045. So this is very much in line with what you were discussing, Professor Fujikawa, in terms of actually having net negative emissions technologies at play as well. So Hawaii's goal was very much set in the context of the US not making good on the 2015 Paris Agreement when President Trump came into office and sort of ran on the platform that the US would be pulling out of the Paris Agreement, right? And so many states, including US, had a sort of pushback with we are still in the Paris Agreement, even if the federal government is not. So Hawaii was amongst the states that joined the US Climate Alliance. And these are states that said, we're still going to make good on these goals and push forward climate action, regardless of federal government actions. And I should say, of course, this has changed again with the change of administration, right? So the US actually only left the Paris Agreement for a 2-month period, but for a 4-year period, it didn't necessarily move forward federal goals, right? So the damage from a greenhouse gas standpoint is still there, but we only left for a 2-month period. The U.S. is back in the climate, into the Paris Agreement and trying to figure out sort of what is this more whole of government approach. But so what have states been doing, right? Because I think that map that Brendan showed in terms of local government action, the U.S. has a lot going on in terms of local government climate action, and it is this response to federal sea changes. In Hawaii, just to give a little bit of context of what does our greenhouse gas emissions look like, or what are the general trends. So these are the years for which we have official state inventories, and my research team works on the inventory portion, but in particular, we focus on projecting the future so that our state knows where these trends are going and why, right? So for the years we have official inventories, you can see that we have had some greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but largely we've stayed flat, right? We can't claim deep decarbonization yet. We have started to decouple economic activities from greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that in this time period here, because this was a period of economic growth. and our emissions managed to stay flat, which, we shouldn't celebrate too much about that because it's nowhere near what we need to actually achieve, but it's the beginning of delinking that relationship. In terms of projections into the future, what we have found is that the most reductions that we're seeing are from the electric sector, from stationary emissions, from the switching of our electricity generation from a very fossil fuel based, primarily coal and oil, to renewables. And that has been the predominant policy mechanism that has been reducing our greenhouse gas emissions over time. And you can see that in the stationary combustion, which is this light blue. During the pandemic, our estimate was most of the reductions came from the transport sector, with about 9 months of dramatically lower air transportation emissions in particular, right? But we expect this to basically rebound. In fact, it already has, right? Hawaii's greenhouse gas emissions are probably very similar to the rebound trends that Brendan showed on the global scale. And so most of our expectation of further reductions are, again, from assuming that we're going to make good on some of these electricity to renewable transition goals. So the policy tool that we've been using in order to transition our electric sector is called a Renewable Portfolio Standard. And it's a very, very common policy tool in the US as well as globally. And it sets a particular target date and amount of renewable energy you want to see in the grid. And this kind of tool functions fairly well within the power sector because it tends to be a highly regulated sector. So you can achieve these kinds of mandated goals within the regulatory process, right? Within the contracts process. And so there are 30 states plus the District of Columbia that have renewable, or sometimes they're called clean energy standards, depending on what they count as renewable. And this is often contested, right? Are these really renewable? What are we trying to get at? What is the objective? And it is hard to compare what some of the states are doing because there are different definitions of technologies and what counts. So Hawaii has a 100% goal by the year 2045. We were the first state to set that target, and then there have been a number of states, you can see them the states that have this sort of hatching colors that have since followed and have also set 100% targets. Hawaii is kind of an interesting illustrative example, right? Because we don't power share with the rest of the continental US. We're not part of the continental grid system. So in this sense, our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are the same, right? All of our scope 2 emissions do happen within our border. And this is our Renewable Portfolio Standard sort of success to date. We have, since we adopted a new RPS in 2010, its first compliance year was 2015. You can see that a tremendous amount of renewable energy was laid out in Hawaii's grid in a really pretty short period of time, right? And then moving forward so the last year I've updated this was before the pandemic in 2019, but you can see that, just the layout of renewable energy was very, very rapid. And so from this perspective, the RPS has been very successful, right? It is, however, you can see that it's starting to reach a point where it's not rising as quickly. It does seem like many of the low-hanging fruit have been achieved. And so now the question is, what are the continued momentum of transition to renewables, and what does that look like? Just breaking this graphic down a little bit, you'll see that most of the gains have been in distributed rooftop solar. That's this lighter yellow. Utility scale solar is this really bright yellow. And utility scale solar are the projects that are slated and planned to move forward in a large way. Those are the things that the utility and our state energy planning agencies are really sort of pushing on in terms of meeting generation and load going forward, that with large scale battery systems. Wind projects were sort of initially installed. They've been quite contentious. The locations of them have raised into a lot of questions in terms of community impacts as well as biodiversity impacts. And so it's a little hard at this point to see huge expansion of land-based wind, although there will probably be some. And in the future planning documents, there is quite a bit of emphasis on offshore wind, although nothing is sort of commercial and available yet. You'll notice here that we do have a geothermal power plant that operates on Hawaii Island, and it was actually shuttered in this time period because of the Kilauea erupted and went through the power plant, and so it was shuttered for several years. The plan is to get that back on, or it is getting back online. And so that is a substantially important base load, renewable energy base load for Hawaii Island. But whether it will, the extent to which it will scale is quite in question. So there's been a lot of RPS success to date. There is a question of, are we going to achieve the 100% by 2045? And what is the optimal technology mix to actually get there? What are the land use and community impacts? But then I think one thing to put this in context is we're still just talking about the electric sector, right? We're still just talking about a fraction of our actual total greenhouse gas emissions. And so what do we do about, the economy-wide emissions? What do we do about transport from ground, marine, and air as the other major sectors? So something that the state legislature had requested for deliberation last legislative session was an understanding of how would a carbon tax work in Hawaii, what would be the economic and greenhouse gas impacts. So this was a research study that we completed for the state to get a handle on, if we adopted a carbon tax, right, what would we expect the economic effects to be, both to the entire economy, to household well-being, as well as how much greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced through different tax rates. So the idea of a carbon price is that you put a additional price, additional fee on a per unit of greenhouse gas emissions, which equates to a per unit of fossil fuels, right? And that raises the price of fossil fuels. It's levied on the producer, but that doesn't mean the entire burden is on the producer, right? The burden would be shared from the producer and the consumers. And so you would have an incentive to switch to lower greenhouse gas intensive activities on both the production and consumption sides, right? So behavior switches and ultimately greenhouse gas emissions fall. We looked at two different levels of a carbon tax. The first level is set to our federal estimates, what's used within federal cost benefit analyses of the social cost of carbon. So whether this is actually the right number for the social cost of carbon is highly debated within research studies. There's a lot of critique about why this number is too low, right? That when this pathway was determined within study analysis in the Obama administration, that they did not consider a wide enough sort of consideration of global damages, not enough consideration for uncertainty. And so there's a lot of reason to think these numbers should be higher. And in fact, the Biden administration early on had committed to re-looking at this and to updating it. But as a starting point, this is our federally adopted social cost of carbon. And so we took it as our low tax. That said, that is a bit of a misnomer, right? Like if Hawaii were to adopt a federal social cost of carbon rate of a carbon tax, it would be the highest carbon tax in North America. So it's not low in comparison to what people are doing. It's just low in comparison to the needs of the climate crisis, right? Of meeting the climate crisis. So then we also looked at this much higher tax scenario. And here it was pretty random. It was, let's pick a really high number. Let's get to something like $1,000 at the end and see what that does to Hawaii's economy and greenhouse gas trajectory. So if we had that high carbon tax scenario, we would achieve a decarbonization much more akin to what you're calling for, Brendan, in an accelerated decarbonization, right? Not a linear approach, but you do more now because it really does matter in the accumulation, right? And we would get much closer to not actually zero, but you'd get closer to a number where then you could start engaging offsets and other things. With the federal social cost of carbon, we only see a 10% a cumulative reduction between 2025 and 2045 relative to our baseline emissions. And we do see that our baseline emissions are on a downward trend, right? And this is an assumption about our renewable portfolio standard being made good on, as well as assumptions around federal fuel standards for cars and trucks, right? So there are, I just want to make the point, there are embedded assumptions into the baseline that may or may not actually happen. In terms of the impacts to the overall economy, they're really relatively small, right? With the federal social cost of carbon, it's a 0.5% reduction in our total productivity, right? And if you think about like that relative to a baseline of growth, it's not going to be that perceptible to us, right? And even in this very high carbon price case, it's under a 5% reduction, right? Relative to the baseline. It's still a growth trajectory. So the overall economic impacts are relatively small. And this is really a worst case scenario of like a state going it alone, right? Ideally, you would want to build a consortium and do this together as part of a carbon pricing consortium where other states do this too, at which point the economic effects would be even smaller. One interesting thing we found in this research was how important it was to use the carbon tax revenues to support a just transition, right? To give the carbon tax revenues back to households, particularly because we were able to look at the spending profiles of lower income in comparison to higher income households. And lower income households have they have a larger burden as it relates to gasoline and electricity. A smaller burden as it relates to things like aviation, because that really is more of a luxury good, right? But if you give monies back to households, we did find it really does help lower income households within this transition. You can see the scenarios where we give money back to households are the purple ones. And so in the social cost of carbon example we have here, when we give dividends back to households, we actually find that all households are made better off. And we find that's true through the entire time period of the transition through 2045. So anyways, the way we use those revenues and think about the normative aspects of this kind of policy is also very important. In terms of what Hawaii has been doing for sort of municipal climate action, we've been working with the city and county of Honolulu considerably to do its first ever climate action plan and to really develop pathways there. I should say we still don't have a carbon tax in the state. It was deliberated on. It was deliberated on again this session. It has not passed. So whether we actually will have that price mechanism is a big what if, right? We'll see whether it's introduced again next year. In other states like Washington State, it did take several iterations for different versions to go through. So we'll see what happens in Hawaii. The city's climate action plan, we centered it around 9 strategies that go through the variety of scope 1 to scope 3 sources, but we really focused on the things in which the city has jurisdiction, right? The things in which the city can really impact. And I think I'm running out of time, so I just want to focus on a couple of things here. The first is ground transportation, right? This is where the city does have a lot of ability to shape urban form and the way we get around and it interacts a lot with federal policy because federal policy is what really guides the kinds of cars and trucks we're able to buy. But what the city can do is really determine how far we go, right? Urban form, vehicle miles traveled, those are the things the city has a lot of ability to, and these are the 4 county mayors signing a similar transition to renewable sources of ground transportation by 2045. So we did a lot of modeling, scenario analysis for the city to understand the different levers, right? From reducing VMT to switching to electric vehicles for our light duty cars and trucks, as well as for our big buses and diesel, things that are currently run on diesel. What would we have to do in order to achieve something close to zero by 2045 within these realms and the kinds of policies that would need to be pushed on? So to me, the most important thing was to really push on ambitious multimodal policies for the city and then support the federal transition to EVs. In closing, just some key takeaways. Hawaii's greenhouse gas emissions really are primarily about the energy sector. So these are the things, this massive transition from fossil fuels is what we really have to be focusing on. Our electric sector emissions, we do have policies in place there and emissions are declining, but actual realization of those policies is going to take a lot of work, right? It's not just like, oh, the goal is set, the policy is there. It's land use planning, it's community input. It's going to be a lot of work between now and 2045 to see that through. And it's still just the electric sector, right? We do need some better economy-wide tools to get to the full picture of decarbonization by 2045. And so that's where the whole of government approach is really critical. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Makina, for this very insightful presentation as well. As a reminder to everyone, we're going to open the Q&A session now to all participants. So please please write your questions, post your questions in the chat or raise your hand. And later on, we will first be looking at the presentations, at the chat questions. I just wanted to add, I really find it very interesting today, the three presenters that we had, to have these various viewpoints, the technical side and the policy side. And I just really learned a lot today. And so thank you very much. So let's take a look at some of the questions that already came up at the beginning as well. And I would like to first point out the question by Sami Khan, which was already answered, responded to by Professor Fujikawa, but maybe you could use the time here because not everybody's reading the chat. So we had the question by Sami Khan from, how do you address membrane fouling? So maybe
thank you for I thank you for the question. I already answered in a chat window, but I think mainly such kind of fouling, especially in the duct system, is just not simple ducts. In that case, we may be able to use something like simple air filter to eliminate the dust. So in that case, we may be able to avoid such kind of fouling issues. This is the answer.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you very much. He also then added a question, so I'm just going to continue with that. How about tiny moisture droplets in the air? Would they affect membrane performance?
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I can say this is good or not. I mean, especially for for agricultural use, such kind of water should be used for the feeding for the plant. Luckily, our membrane also can capture the humidity from the air. In that case, that one is good. And also for the membrane, from the viewpoint of membrane performance, humidity can enhance the CO2 selectivity. That is why, basically humidity is good for us, but also sometimes not good for some process system. In that case, we have to introduce something like system part to eliminate the humidity from the system. That is my answer.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And then we had one final question for Professor Fujikawa's presentation directly from Noni Nuriani. Noni, I don't know, do you want to ask it here by yourself? Show your face and
yes, thanks, Natalie. Thank you for the opportunities. Thanks so much for the presentation from our keynote speakers today. All very interesting. And also, I was just wondering as well, if I may, do we both can be shared with the slides from today's presentation? They are all very interesting. That would be great. Thank you. Yes, my question to Professor Fujikawa is in relation to the the carbon capture technologies and a lot of happenings, especially like in Australia. We have a lot of coal-fired power plants still, and we fear that a lot of the carbon capture technologies are justification from the coal industry to keep running rather than pushing the government to go to a more aggressive on renewable energies. And so that's why it's really great to see direct air capture technologies being being researched here. Just wondering whether whether we actually use more energy when we capture carbon, because that's one of the slides showing fans and how much do we actually need to pressurize the air to go through the membrane. I guess probably we don't want it to be like too much energy when you use a fan, and then you're actually using more carbon rather than what you capture from the air. Or probably it's all right if you're actually using 100% renewable energy for the fans. Yeah, the question is it possible now? Or maybe first is that energy for the fans, or is it, and then also is it possible to actually have a passive direct air capture? Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, we are doing some national projects. We always receive the many such kind of question. Is it a real negative, CO2 negative or not? So actually, honestly speaking, yes. Membrane system is negative. So the reason why we put a fan in front of the membrane system is our membrane has a good performance. That is why not pressurized, just supplying the air. That is why we need, because of our membrane has a large gas bag. That is why if we don't put such kind of fan, the membrane performance is decreased because of our air supply is not sufficient compared to our membrane performance. That is why this is not pressurized system. But from the viewpoint of the process, so vacuuming is a system will contribute to enhance the membrane performance. But in our system, vacuuming process is the most energy intensive part. Of course, we cannot use fossil-based, fossil energy-based electricity. But when we use the photovoltaic system, especially in Japan, so our process, LCA, life cycle assessment, tells us, total CO2 emission capture amount. So totally, our membrane system is negative. That is my answer. Is it okay for you?
Yep, that's great. Thank you for the explanation, Professor.
Thank you. But of course, it is it totally depends on the regional situation. In Japan, photovoltaic system, kind of say CO2 emission coefficient is not so slightly high, and electricity cost is slightly high. But when we install somewhere in Australia or something like that, in that case, even photovoltaic cost is smaller than Japan. In that case, much more feasible. I hope Hawaii is also a good candidate, maybe. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I see we do have a number of comments, but do we have some direct questions to the presentations themselves? If not, I'm just going to kind of slowly already move into the panel discussion, because the comments that we're having in the chat, I think, are more like to lead to the broader discussion anyway. So I'm going to start with one comment right away to get the discussion already started from Professor or Mr. Kang Tong from Shanghai Jiao Tong University. This was a comment relating to Brandon's presentation, I believe, but I think everybody can give some input here too. So I don't know, Professor Tong, if you're there, maybe you would like to, instead of me reading it out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation in the morning. So my comment is more about, I think there are a lot of confusion about when we are counting greenhouse gas emissions from cities, because urban systems, they are more like complicated. They have the embeddedness of larger systems. But I think my comment is more about people now thinking about accounting greenhouse gas emissions from either consumption-based, you do the consumption, but you put everything into the consumption, or you do production, you put everything you can claim to be production. But the thing is, like for cities, it's a mix of, we have manufacturing, we have businesses, and we have homes living in it. And I think the third approach is looking at the key infrastructure, like energy, transportation, water, waste management, and then what are the services, and also buildings, etc., food, if you count broadly. And then this approach will account how much of the services you needed for both your production, businesses, and also your consumption in household, in government, how much demand is, and then what's the direct emissions from the use phase, and then what's the emissions embedded in the supply chain. And then I think these can help us to understanding cities better and also supporting urban policy better, because then cities know what they have control over. And then for the grid decarbonization, they have very limited policy leverage over it. So then they know, okay, this is state or like utilities responsibility. We can demand it for change, but we don't have sufficient resources to do change. And then they will know what they can do. They can regulate some demand side, intervene some of the demand side. That helps us, like policymakers knowing which parts they can do what, and cities knowing what they can do better. And then household consumers knows, okay, this is the supply chain of all of my key infrastructure-based greenhouse gas footprinting. And then there's some non-infrastructure based. Now we can know those things much better, not only from like production and consumption-based approach. And then the bottom line is the accounting approach should link with the policy leverage of the governance system. That's, I think, the bottom line of that. And I hope this kind of get more to my comments. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Brendan, would you like to?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on, your observation. And I totally agree with you about the direction that local governments should be going. And as you rightly pointed out, that they all should be adopting what's this global protocol for community scale emission inventories. So that's the ideal, but the reality is it's much more challenging on the ground. And some of the, I was referring to in my presentation to a 2017 study that was done for Helsinki, Stockholm, and Copenhagen. And even though they have very ambitious targets, the researchers found that their accounting methods, there were issues with their accounting methods. And they are sort of advanced in this area, but there are many other cities who are not even remotely approaching this in the same systematic manner. And even a city like Leeds in England, which does have really detailed inventories and detailed policy measures, they're still struggling with this scope 3 consumption emissions question. So hopefully we'll get a handle on this. But I still think that it's certainly not the case that all cities are really producing robust emissions inventories. And then the other thing, just a final point, is that in Japan, from what I've seen, and I haven't looked at every city, but a large number of cities that I've looked at are not using the protocol. They're using completely different methodology. So what I would suggest is that we need cities to have absolutely transparent and completely open information on how their inventories are put together. And it's actually very difficult to find these. You search around and so on. And so I think all of this should be open to the public, and then they should really provide regular inventories. I mean, McKenna was showing Hawaii how not every year, it's not an annual inventory. So this process of actually having really good accounts is very important, because it's how you know whether you're getting to the target. And if we can't measure it, then we're not going to be able to achieve it. So I was really just trying to point to that, but I totally agree with you that there are quite standard methodologies that can be adopted, like the protocol, and there are cities that are trying their best to do it. So thank you very much for that question, or that comment.
Thank you very much. Okay, wonderful. McKenna, did you want to answer, comment on that point as well, or you good?
Sure. I really just want to appreciate what you said, Ken, about there's sort of the act of doing the inventory, right? And then there's understanding the policy levers and authorities, and they don't always line up, right? And I think that is where a lot of the critiques of cities that have these goals, and then they're falling short of the goals. A lot of times it's because the things of which they want to influence, they don't necessarily have pure authority to do so, right? Which which the point I was trying to get across in terms of this whole of government approach. It's good to have cities acknowledge what they can and can't influence directly, so that indirectly they can start to put pressure there, right?
Thank you very much. And I see in the chat as well a question by Christina Schönleber from APRU Secretariat. So maybe, yeah, instead again of me reading it out, everybody has maybe seen it, right? It's at 11:30 a.m. It's about Hong Kong and the situation of EV. So Christina, maybe you would like to.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the 3 presentations. It was great. Technology, and then looking at the city and government actions. But that made me think, the 3 presentations made me think, well, this sounds great. And we only have 13 years to get to which is not very long. And what is it that we can actually do? And then what I put in the chat, it's not really about Hong Kong. I mean, I live in Hong Kong and I know about Hong Kong. That's why I put this as an example in there. And I think what Hong Kong is aiming to do is great. But if you look at it in detail, it's not nearly enough. And it's going towards those, some of the presentations that we've heard. So the carbon capture sounds brilliant. I think it's probably really important, but it's not ready. It sounds like it, and it also has a lot of problems with it. So I wanted to find out what our 3 expert speakers, do they have any suggestions of, because we have a group here of, experts, of young experts, old experts, middle-aged experts, whatever, and also people that are interested. Is there anything that how can we utilize our interest over the next 13 years to actually get to somewhere close to what we need to do?
Maybe Professor Fujikawa, you would like to. Oh, you're muted, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Well, it is a tough question for me, actually, because I'm a kind of science-based researcher. That is why I know. But we have to change the situation. But of course, when we consider about the negative emission, for example, case, people just always considering the mass treatment. So this is far from our daily society life, daily life. So it means normal people cannot understand how much important, what is that. In that case, we are also trying to develop some small product to utilize our basic technology to feed the people, that people can feel we are contributing to mitigate, suppress, decrease the CO2 emission. That kind of activity also important. I can say this is kind of social acceptance or social outreach activity. Of course, finally we have to manage the massive amount of the air to reduce CO2 concentration, but also such kind of outreach activity, not outreach, kind of say commercialization for the consumer level situation may also greatly contribute. Actually, my wife always asking me to give me something like a soda maker in my home, right? Of course, amount is pretty small, but such kind of product may also inspire, encourage the people to contribute, such kind of activity. I think, especially from the collaboration with the Department of Art, they have a good idea to develop the nice commercial, nice product based on our technology for daily use or say normal life use. For example, say we have say pub. We drank many beer, but this beer is often used the kind of gas cylinder based CO2. Of course, when we consider transport or production of CO2, they emit a lot of CO2, right? But if we can take the CO2 as a power, good. We can enjoy beer. We can contribute reduction of CO2. That kind of activity may also contribute to change the social mind or something like that. This is my, maybe this is not straightforward answer to you, but this is my kind of feeling, comment. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And we got feedback right away from Christina that she loves this idea of consumer-based carbon capture tech. So thank you. Brendan, would you like to go next on this question?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really difficult to get into the specifics of one city because my knowledge of what's going on in Hong Kong is somewhat limited. But what I've seen happening elsewhere, which I think is a good guide, is a kind of phased approach to how we tackle these problems. So you start off with identifying what's economically feasible and relatively easy to implement. And then the next is what's technically feasible, and then develop measures based on that. And then you set up the following category, which is innovative measures, but they're costly and technically difficult. So we'll get round to that. And then I tend to see cities leaving behavioral change to the fourth phase, but that they know they need to get around to addressing behavioral change. But they think it's much more difficult because you have to say to people, well, don't use your car, walk, change your lifestyle, change your behavioral patterns. But and so it means that you can move rapidly in certain areas because you've kind of costed measures, and you can convince policymakers that this isn't going to break the local economy. This is something that you can do. And then while you're implementing that, you start to explore the technically challenging problems, or you have teams working on that, and so on and so forth. I think Leeds is a good example of that. I keep pointing to them because they're actually doing very good work, and they're breaking things. They have a report that just breaks it down along those lines, but I've seen other cities adopting it as well. So, I think in the Hong Kong context, it would be really good to see the Hong Kong government, getting as many of those economically feasible measures implemented quickly. And that can be prioritized according to also the, where are the biggest emitters? What's the biggest problem they need to tackle up front?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Makena, would you like to give a reply here?
Sure. Thanks, Christina, for the question. It's nice to see you. I'll sort of add to what Brendan said, right? I think maybe take sort of different disciplinary perspectives. I think, Brendan, you gave kind of the planner's hat, right? How to approach this from a planning perspective and sort of the ways to roll this out in sort of starting with what is feasible, what will people accept, and then how do you move it forward, right? And Christina, your question is also about how do you then match this by the sectors, right? Because you could be doing something on the transport side, but maybe if you're not moving forward the electricity sector side too, there's a mismatch, right? And so I think a lot of the planning approaches are kind of like, we'll have these different sectoral approaches and try to harmonize them the best you can. And if it's not perfect, right, if it's a few years where electric vehicles aren't great, then that's okay because I like this term, they're appreciating climate assets over time, right? And so they're going to get better. And so dealing with a little bit of inefficiency in the grand scheme of things is okay. So I do think that's that's one perspective, and that's what we're doing, generally speaking, in most cities and most places. And so it's kind of what functions. And then the economist's answer, taking a very different disciplinary hat, would be to come in and say, let's harmonize this all with prices, right? And so if we had a carbon tax, we wouldn't have to worry about the sectoral interactions so much because it would sort itself out. But the flip side is that that's not happening, right? Because we don't have the sort of political will to do that. So anyways, that's my thinking there. And I think just a last thought is something I think we're starting to see is people are more willing to adopt carbon pricing at kind of a low level to serve as that umbrella policy that helps to harmonize some of these sectoral interactions and issues, but not necessarily as that massive change instrument. And so there's some middle of this too.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Now, do we have any more questions or comments from the audience? Because I don't see any in the question box anymore, in the chat box, but I'm sure everybody would like to say something and is just shy. And I do see that everybody's kind of turning off their cameras. It would be so much nicer to look at more faces. But Yes. So any comments, other questions? Okay, Adrian Fusek, you raised your hand, so please. Adrian,
Hi,
I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong.
Oh, no, that was perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for these three keynotes. They're very, very interesting. So my question is for Professor Fujikawa, and I was just thinking with the direct air capture and this, the membrane technology, it seemed to me, so you had the desktop, you know, the time lapse video in your lab, which I thought was really, it made me think about what would be the possibility of incorporating that kind of technology with existing heating and cooling systems that people have in their homes, or the industrial scale kind of heating and cooling systems. I'm wondering if you've thought about that at all, and if the scale of that technology would even be something that would be possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, this is a good question for me. Honestly, target is to install. Our real final target is such kind of small system into the house, right? But also this is kind of idea or final dream. But also our realistic target is to install our system into the office building. Because now our system can compose is composed of two parts. One is capture part and conversion part. So of course we can use separately. In that case, for example, the capture part installed in the office room, especially in the air conditioning system to capture CO2 during the circulation. Then accumulate the capture CO2 in the, for example, underground for the CO2 conversion, and then converted CO2 injected the gas pipeline to circulate the local society. That is our first realistic scenario to install our system into the real world. Of course, maybe we can consider other type of scenario. And also we roughly calculate how much amount of CO2 capture in the one office building. So usually, say we have a rather big office building. In that case, we can capture CO2 at such kind of office building about say several thousand tons per year from the one building. So of course there's so many buildings in a large city. That is why I think we can contribute to reduce the CO2 and utilize the capture CO2 as a value-added compound. Of course, so that is our kind of scenario, which we are considering.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, Mr. Fujikawa, Professor Fujikawa kind of disappeared in between, but the voice was always there, so that's good. Okay, wonderful. Do we have any other questions or comments? Because I actually do see that we're kind of running out of time. So if it's okay with our speakers and the audience, I think it would be also a good time to start wrapping it up a little bit. But that means I would like to ask our three panelists for some final or concluding thoughts, actually, some reflections on today's sessions so that we have some sort of outcome here. Yeah, and I know you're also maybe interested in this whole session is about also collaborating and networking the series. So maybe you can give your thoughts here as well. And I would say we can start with, I'll just go from the back now. So I would start with Makena maybe, because change the direction.
Thanks, Natalie. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for the great questions. And I'm going to use my time with this to put in a plug. For those of you interested in continuing this conversation and collaboration, join us for the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscape Conference in Honolulu. So you can be in the picture that's behind me in Honolulu in September. I'll put in the website link into the chat, but it's going to be from September 6th to September 9th. And I encourage you to join us and to join a working group.
Wonderful, thank you. We've actually put the chat link in there as well. If it's, I hope it's the correct link in the chat now. Okay, yes, Brendan. Thank you, Makena. Brendan, what about you?
Yeah, I feel that we need a greater sense of urgency, but at the same time, I think it's quite an exciting decade we have ahead of us if we really go for this and start to bring about the changes that we've just been talking about in today's panel. And I think that we should really try to embrace this period rather than run away and hide from it. And so I think for each one of us, the question is, how can I embrace this? What can I do to take this forward and really address this big challenge in front of us? So I think we should be excited about it. We shouldn't be frightened. That's my message.
Wonderful comment. Thank you very much. And Professor Fujikawa.
Thank you very much. And I pretty much enjoyed this, symposium and seminar.
Okay, now he's totally gone. So that's a pity. Oh, you're back. Okay. Professor Fujikawa, do you want to give it another try? Your sound broke off.
Right.
And
So my Zoom doesn't work well. Anyway, sorry. I pretty much enjoyed this seminar, and also I'm a technology-based scientist. Usually, kind of technology-based researcher really focus on the performance or say mechanism, something like that. It is difficult to communicate with totally different research area. So Japanese government also trying to encourage us to promote interdisciplinary research, but this issue is totally interdisciplinary. And sometimes I don't understand quite well, but I could see many different viewpoints from the economics or social aspects, something like that. Such kind of through this kind of activity, also this chance will be good for the student to learn, to have a more wide range viewpoint. I think also I expected many students try to jump into this research field. And then, of course, you have many expertise area, but no, you can make a more wider viewpoint, I think, through this kind of research activity. I think this is a good chance to, right? Thank you very much.
wonderful. Thank you very much for this quite good, very good final words, I think, to wrap it up. Thank you once more thank you very much once again to our wonderful speakers. And I would like to ask for a round of applause, either by reaction button or by, showing your hands in the camera. This was really, really interesting. And I do know that all three of our presenters today are very open for discussions and collaborations, I'm sure. So you can contact them by email or stay in touch with them. I'm sure no one will push you away. And so again, thank you very much. And thank you also to all the participants for your active participation in this session.